I am Jackson Hudecki. I am the Bird Study Group Director for the Hamilton Naturalists Club. I'm also the Special Programs Coordinator at Royal Botanical Gardens, and I've started a weird little Instagram page called Beaks and Geeks. You can find me at any of those locations, and I'm here to chat about something that I'm passionate about, kind of as a hobby, but also because it's just something that's greater than all of us. I think you're here for that reason. I think we all kind of work, if you're working in this industry, for that reason. So I'm happy to be a resource for you tonight and going forth through however we connect on birds, on wildlife, on education, you name it. Feel free at any point to throw anything into the chat. I've got it open. I can see it here. So if you have questions, if you want to know something, I'm just going to talk at you for a bit, but I do want to answer your questions. So if you want to know something, maybe not necessarily, I saw this type of bird in my backyard, what could it be? But feel free to put anything in the chat and I'll do my best to answer it. If you're not aware of the Hamilton Naturalists Club, we are a 102-year-old organization that got its start by protecting Cootes paradise back in 1919. Right now, we kind of focus on a 40-kilometer radius from Dundurn Castle, which is what you're seeing here. The Hamilton Naturalists Club is a partner in the Cootes to Escarpment Eco Park project, and we've got multiple properties throughout southern Ontario. We've even just purchased 2 properties in the last couple of years. One falls within the Eco Park, which is just kind of beside the driving range on Highway 6 there in Snake Road. One of the biggest donations made to the club of $250,000 was made to help purchase this property right beside this driving range. And it's this deep ravine, which is a pretty incredible property. And then as well, one kind of up in the Puslinch area, which is pretty cool. But we've been maintaining property for decades now with the hope that it doesn't get developed on. We've removed as many invasive species as we can, and we're trying to let life just occur in our properties. And that's kind of the goal with a lot of this, is just to give nature a space to exist on its own. So it's cheap to become a member of the Hamilton Naturalists Club. We have kind of one full-time employee and a couple part-time employees, and the rest of us are just volunteering our time for the greater good. So the HSA, the Hamilton Study Area, if nature occurs within it, there's constant sharing of what is being found around there, so that others could go enjoy it as well. So check out Hamilton Nature across both Facebook and Instagram. I think we're on Twitter too. Either way, we're across social media, so there's lots of different ways to connect. I'm a Fleming College graduate, and then I went on and worked at Ontario Parks at Wasaga Beach Provincial Park for a summer before getting hired at Royal Botanical Gardens. And I've been at RBG for about 12 years now, working in education. And I spend a lot of time at the Arboretum. So a lot of my birding knowledge kind of comes from just wandering these trails. But I'm a born and raised Hamiltonian. I just live, Tom and I are kind of neighbors. I can kind of see where he lives near me. We're just kind of down here near Dundurn Castle. So a lot of my birding occurs, and as a father of 2, I can only really kind of just steal away for an hour here, an hour there. So I do try and spend a lot of time around Cootes. And like I was mentioning, the Hamilton Bird Protection Society is who first helped protect Cootes Paradise from being infilled and developed upon in 1919. Through a lot of some changing of hands, RBG eventually took kind of ownership of it in 1941. So RBG is in its 80th year this year, which is kind of cool. But it's at one point could have been filled in, and we may not have had what is there today. This is what it used to look like. This is a very early photograph, and of course it didn't, you can see there's a straight channel through there. That was dredged. That's not how rivers flow. Rivers meander. So it's been tampered with even in this photograph, but lots of emergent plant life, which is great. this is what it looks like now if you've been by, and Tom was showing some photos earlier. So not many plants, and this picture's probably a couple years old too. So there's quite a bit of plant life now emerging through there. I can only imagine what it looked like pre-European settlement. But if you were a bird, and this is a metallic bird here getting a bird's eye view of this area, if you were migrating, this looks like a pretty handsome spot to go land and to rest and to dine and to drink up while you're on your travels. So Hamilton has several IBBAs, important bird and biodiversity areas. There's many in Ontario, but Hamilton, the kind of all of the Dundas Valley and the Cootes Paradise Marsh are designated important bird areas, and it doesn't sound like much, but it basically is significant in that we have so much biodiversity occurring in properties in the Cootes to Escarpment Eco Park project, in those properties that when studied, when looked upon, in seeing the kind of life that's in there, it can't help but designate it as an IBA. And it's not just because we're witnessing birds around it, it's because of the plant and the insect life that is also occurring there. But to be designated an IBA, there's a whole list of criteria, and this is some of that. These are other IBBAs in Ontario. So you can see kind of a lot of where there's water is where you're going to encounter an IBA, which is pretty cool. It's a bit of a gap right here in the harbor, and if you're a Hamiltonian, you could probably figure out why. But here's kind of what I mean. This is what's designated in the IBA section, and a lot of bird life occurs in Lake Ontario and around the lift bridge and in Cootes and in the Dundas Valley. And that is because of the depth of Lake Ontario. So all the Great Lakes drain into one another before pouring out into Lake Ontario, before going out down the St. Lawrence Seaway. But it gets shallower the farther west you go and the closer to Hamilton you get. So that has something to do with water temperatures and the kind of life that's found within the water, and then the life that then engages and eats that life underneath the water that maybe we can't see. But water aside, if we're talking about plants, we live in a Carolinian forest zone, which is found nowhere else in Canada except for southern Ontario. And that's pretty significant. I mean, the highest amount of people life live in southern Ontario. The only forest type of a Carolinian forest zone is in southern Ontario, and the highest amount of biodiversity found in the nation is found in the Carolinian forest zone around all of these people. Mind-boggling, but that's where you live, and that's why it's important that what Tom and Chelsea are doing and what Mara and all the partners are doing is important, because we're trying to maintain and preserve and celebrate the biodiversity that is found where we live, which is pretty remarkable. And when you're a bird, I mean, you might not know, you don't know those names. I mean, I don't want to speak for birds, but they're going from habitat to habitat, and they're deciding based on their own criteria of where they are choosing to live and to make and raise their young before migrating, which we're in the heart of migration right now. This is fall migration. I know fall starts tomorrow, but for the last 2 weeks, we've been in bird migration, which has been pretty incredible. And these are just like, some examples of how birds choose to migrate, just to give you a glimpse of how far some of these birds will go. And you can see some corridors that some pick. They'll fly in the mainland before flying right over the ocean, but some will choose to follow the coastlines. All kind of depends on the species. And some birds will just go from almost as far north to as far south as you can get in the Western Hemisphere, which is pretty crazy. For example, this particular warbler, a blackpoll warbler, might migrate over 12,000 miles every year, right? Look at where they choose to go, which is pretty incredible considering the bird's about this big. But let's talk about what birds are. Has the warmer temperatures affected migration season patterns? It's maybe a bit too early to tell that. It's likely. I've heard some people kind of surmise that everything's happening 2 weeks earlier this year, maybe in the latter part of this year. So that could be the case. birds are kind of following, and dragonflies and butterflies migrate as well. And I think they're kind of following the Earth's pull. So there's something that's driving them to migrate. But if they're not finding food, if something's happening to their habitat, they'll of course get started earlier. So the warmer temperatures may have affected that. The amount of moisture may affect that as well. There's a bunch of unknowns right now, but because it's currently happening, it's kind of too early to tell that. But great question, and keep putting questions in the chat. I'll answer them as I go. And I am really talking fast because I have like 120 slides in this thing that I'm only just trying to kind of skim the surface right now while I can. I'm not testing you on any of this, mind you. So, but we know it's a bird based on its body type, right? Based on its beak, based on its feathers, based on its wings, based on its tail. And we're just kind of talking at it at a hobby level here. We're not talking at like an ornithologist level. I am not an ornithologist. I may never be, but that's okay. You don't need to be. You do not need to be an ornithologist at all. But knowing some terms is helpful, because when you talk to birders, when you're in the field, when you have questions, if someone came to me and started asking me to help identify a bird just based on their memory, I'm going to ask them a series of questions. And I'm going to ask them, like, what patterns did you notice on the bird? And where were some of those patterns? Did you notice it in the face or around the eye or on its cap? Or were there wing bars on its wings? Or what did it look like on its belly or its breast? I might talk about size. You know, I might ask you, like, was it sparrow size, which is pretty small? Was it robin size, which is getting a bit bigger? Or was it crow size or larger? That might help get you thinking about, you know, and when you're looking at a bird and trying to think, like, what am I looking at here? Think about how big it might be, not necessarily like in exact inches or centimeters, but just generally. Is it sparrow size? Is it robin size? Or is it crow size? In between or bigger, or heck, even smaller. Location's important too. If you were to come to me and start talking to me about birds and you wanted to know something, well, where were you? And that could be important. Were you walking through a city park? Were you walking in a farmer's field? Were you near a wetland or in a wetland? Were you in an apartment building or in a building somewhere, or were you driving? Sometimes people are like, I'm positive I saw this, and that. Yeah, what were you doing while I was driving? Were you driving the car? Yes. Oh, so you didn't get the best look at it, but either way, location is important. But regardless of what the bird even looks like or its size, a lot of times you can narrow down what species of bird you're talking about based on some of its behaviors. So hopping, flicking its tail, bobbing its head. Is it hidden a lot? Is it just sitting out on a branch, doesn't care if you're there or not? Is it scratching the leaves with its feet? These are things that can help narrow down a particular species, because it might be indicative of just one species. When it's flying, what are you noticing about it? You know, some birds, as they fly, do this skip pattern. Some just book it in a straight line. They don't stop flapping. Some will soar. If it's using its voice, is it singing? Is it trying to attract other birds, or is it just like giving these little peep chip notes? Are you looking at a nest? You know, a whole bunch of different things. There's a lot that will determine what species it is you're looking at. And right now, I'm just going to show you a whole bunch of species that occur around here. And this is going to kind of take up the next little bit. So at any moment, put a question in the chat. But you know, location, you know, birding behavior, and now we're going to get into some birds that are found right here in the Hamilton, Dundas, Burlington, Southern Ontario area. Okay. So a lot of these birds will become familiar to you, and some people will be like, "Oh, I don't know anything about birds," and I'll say, "What bird is this?" And they're like, "Oh, that's easy. It's a blue jay." It's like, oh, okay, great, good. You're off to a great start. What about this? And people will be like, oh, yeah, that's an easy one. That's a cardinal. Sure, it's a cardinal, but in the birding community, we try and use its full name. I'm not even going to start on Latin names with everybody. Don't worry about that. Although it is that's like a global language, is the Latin names for any living thing. You can talk to someone who does not speak English, but you can connect if you're using Latin names for plants or animals or birds. I'll say, okay, maybe you do know what bird this could be. Someone's like, sure, that's a dove. And yeah, there's a few different species of doves that you can encounter. Some are very rare. but this one is a mourning dove. Mourning because it's got like a very mournful kind of quiet coo that it will give. Now, if you look at this picture here, you may notice that there's, you know, a slight difference in these birds. And when I ask people to try and figure out what it is, usually it's the brown head that gives it away. And that would differentiate two different birds in this family. So the one on the left, most people would say, well, that's a chickadee. You're right, that's a black-capped chickadee. And you'd say, well, is the one on the right then a brown-capped chickadee? But it is not. So we have a black-capped chickadee on the left and in Ontario, and one that hardly ventures down south. This is called a boreal chickadee. And it's got that brown head compared to the black head. So if you go to Algonquin Park or farther north and you see a chickadee with a brown head, you're probably looking at a boreal chickadee, which is pretty cool. But the most common one we get around here is the black-capped chickadee. Now this one is about chickadee size. And this is actually a bird that is like, you know, a harbinger of winter. Because this bird, where a lot of birds migrate really far down south, this bird spends a lot of time up north, but when it migrates, in the winter, it migrates here to southern Ontario and spends its whole winter here. You'll see this bird a lot in the dead of winter, and it's known as the dark-eyed junco. And it's got like a two-tone pattern tail. You can kind of see it there. It's like black on one side and white on the other. They spend a lot of time on the ground, not much time at a feeder. You'll see them on the ground if you do have a bird feeder at home. And yeah, definitely a cool bird. And you can see that it's kind of like two-tone in color, dark on top, white on the bottom. So a very neat bird. Now, these are the same bird. This is the same species. It's not a canary. This is an American goldfinch. And on the right, we're looking at a breeding plumage male, so like highlighter yellow, but this bird will stick around in the wintertime and adapt this kind of more like, you know, dull, muted kind of look, kind of yellowy, but kind of gray and white. So this is what it will change its plumage in the wintertime to look a little bit like this. We get two different species of nuthatches around here, the white-breasted here on the left, and the red-breasted nuthatch. If you ever see a bird going down a tree face first, you're looking at a nuthatch. No other species will do that. It's a special adaptation it has. So if you're like, whoa, that bird's climbing down a tree face first, wait, this guy once told me in a webinar only one species will do that, or one family will do that, and that's the nuthatches. So if it's got a big white belly, it's the white-breasted, and if it's much smaller and an orangey kind of red breast, it's the red-breasted nuthatch. So neat little fact. We have lots of woodpeckers around here. Lots and lots and lots of woodpeckers. So on the left, we have a hairy woodpecker, and on the right, a downy. So a hairy is kind of getting like robin size, and a downy is, you know, a bit bigger than a chickadee or a sparrow. And this is a very important species to a Carolinian forest zone, because this bird chooses to spend the majority of its time in a Carolinian forest zone, and it's called a red-bellied woodpecker. So this is a neat bird. If birders live up north in Ontario and they travel down to southern Ontario, it's often a treat for them to see a red-bellied woodpecker because they don't go very far north. And despite the fact that it kind of has a bit of a red head, it's not a red-headed woodpecker, because we actually have what's called a red-headed woodpecker. You can see how deep red this bird is, or its head is anyways. But we also get the yellow-bellied sapsucker and the northern flicker, and a massive bird. This bird is like the size of a crow. This is a pileated woodpecker, and this thing is huge, and it just like, it will do serious damage to a tree. Very loud as well, but a very, very, very cool species. But like, think about all those woodpeckers I just mentioned to you. That's a lot. That's a lot in one family. In fact, if you're thinking about getting into birds, this is a good time to talk a little bit about field guides, because these babies will help you along your way and kind of give you a bit of a glimpse into just like how many dang birds you can encounter in eastern North America. And I would suggest, if you do buy a field guide, make sure you're buying one that says Eastern and not just North America as a whole. But definitely something that would be worthwhile to pick up is a field guide. Even Birds of Ontario would be a good starter book if you are looking for a field guide. Now I'm going to get into this bird. Now everyone says that like, oh, you know, when I see this bird, I know spring is here. This bird will stick around all winter long, believe it or not. They just flock up and hang out in forests before coming into our cities and our parks and getting rid of the invasive species earthworms that are around. This is the American robin, and it's in the thrush family. So is this bird. This is its cousin, the eastern bluebird. And they're related to these thrushes, which is pretty cool because they all kind of look alike, but they're all different species, which is pretty incredible. Now, these birds, you'll find them, this one on the bottom left right now, because they kind of specialize in eating berries. And looking at these two birds, they're actually two different species, but they have a lot of similarities, and I love this bird. This bird's really incredible. They've got this neat kind of, updo, hairdo look to it. This black mask, but this highlighter tip yellow tail is a dead giveaway for this species of bird, and it's known as a cedar waxwing. Now, I mentioned the boreal chickadee earlier. This bird is a relative of the cedar waxwing. It's called the Bohemian waxwing, and it spends a lot of its time in the boreal forests. It will come down in the winter time and look for berries and whatnot, but these birds all are big berry lovers. And the kind of joke in the birding community is that, because berries will ferment and cedar waxwings will eat fermented berries, there's some time where you will encounter some drunk waxwings. They can kind of be, and I've kind of experienced it because I've seen two fly into each other once, just kind of nearby, and they kind of sloppily landed in a tree. So that's just a funny little thing about waxwings, is that they sometimes have a little bit too much fun eating berries. But a really amazing bird, and you'll see them in flocks. You'll see, if you see one, chances are there's 12 to 30 of them near you, which is really cool. So some people will see these birds and they'll just call them little brown birds, or LBJs. You'll sometimes hear little brown jobbies, because when you look at them, it's like, whoa, there's a lot of similarities going on here. It's kind of like the thrush as well, how there are different thrushes. So we start to look at these birds. It's like, wait a minute, I can kind of see that there are some differences between these, and that's when you can work to test your skills to see if you can narrow down the species when you're looking at these birds. And you can see that, okay, these top two birds, they've got some streaking, but this one appears to be a bit more red than the one on the left here. And, the streaking kind of gathers in a blotch, in dark blotches, as opposed to red blotches. And they kind of end around the belly, where these ones go much farther down. It's like, okay, so yeah, we can narrow down the species. And same with these two birds on the bottom. Very similar. The one on the left, a very gray belly, and the one on the right, well, check out this white bib going on here. Oh, and they both have black and white going on in their heads, but the one on the right here has this yellow dot right by its eye. So yeah, there's a bit of a difference between these two. So song sparrow top left, fox sparrow top right, bottom left white crowned sparrow. So on the bottom right, white-throated sparrow. So it's like, oh my goodness, when you start getting into this world of birding, you realize how much there is to learn about it. And that can be a very, very, very confusing and even like disheartening thing if you're getting into this as a hobby, because you start to see things and you're like, you know what, forget about this. I don't know what's going on here. I give up, which is fine. Being discouraged as a birder, as a naturalist, is a completely normal feeling. And you may dive further into it, and you just want to know as much as possible, or it may cause you to throw out your field guide, to actually maybe donate it to somebody. But yeah, it all depends on where you choose to go on your birding journey. And I'm sitting here beside something that would be also very helpful, and that is a pair of binoculars. Now, I've got a very handy dandy pair here. The brand is Vortex, and it's like an 8 by 42, or the 10 by 42 magnitude. So these are pretty strong binoculars, but I would be a terrible birder without these, because they really do allow you to see birds up close and to look for these nuances. Now, can everyone afford binoculars? No. Is Christmas coming? Yes, but you don't need them. they're just super helpful when you do decide to go birding. Here's a few more little brown jobs. House sparrows, which is an introduced species, and same with the house finch, also an introduced species. We find these very commonly in our yards and in our cities. Now I'm going to fly through a bunch of these because I want to be mindful of the time. And maybe Chelsea, you can give me a note on how I'm doing with time so far, because I feel like I'm just throwing a whole bunch of information at you. But when you're walking by a wetland, I want to kind of discourage the thought that you're looking at a duck and you just walk by it. There's a duck, there's some ducks. You really can work to narrow down what species of duck you're looking at. And it might be tough because when you look at all the brown female birds here, look how similar a lot of these birds look. It can be very, like I said, discouraging when you're looking at some of these birds, because it's just like, geez, it could be one of many. But when you slowly start to break down the patterns on some of these birds, you'll realize that, wait a minute, I can work to ID these. In fact, the winter is an amazing time for birding because we get a lot of open water, and that's where birds, when it's farther north and water and there's more ice, they need more habitat, and they come down to the Great Lakes, they come down to southern Ontario, and you'll find a lot of birders with spotting scopes looking down at ducks, because that's what's around. A lot of the songbirds have left for the winter, but you will get lots of ducks. So that's something neat to keep in mind. And do they interbreed? Yes, we call those hybrids. A lot of waterfowl will mate with other species, and so you'll notice that there are hybrids of certain birds out there. Now, these are all different birds. You don't really get many hybrids of these, but these two birds here on the top right is the same bird, common loon, but this middle one here is breeding plumage, and the one down here is the non-breeding or overwintering plumage. So to make birding even harder, at many times in the years, birds will change their plumage depending on their needs, depending on the habitat, depending on their age even, which again is just more to learn, which is incredible. But they all kind of do the same thing. They're all diving birds. You might look at it and see a bird bloop down. You'd be like, whoa, what was that? And you wait a bit, wait for it to pop back up, and hopefully get a better look at it. But again, all the more to learn. We get ducks that nest in trees and wood ducks. We get these incredible long-tailed ducks that you can find in the wintertime, or even the American coot, which as it swims sometimes looks a little bit like a chicken. We have 3 swan species that occur in Ontario. 2 are native, and 1 is an invasive species. The mute swan is an invasive bird from Europe. The tail is this black hump with its orange bill, but you can encounter trumpeter swans. And then at a couple times of the year during migration particularly, we get tundra swans here, especially in the spring. They'll be passing over sometimes in the thousands with this very whistling whoop kind of call, which is pretty cool. And believe it or not, we get pelicans passing through Hamilton a couple of times a year as well. They breed in the potholes of the prairies, and so we definitely do get pelicans around here, which is pretty remarkable. We're seeing staging right now occurring of great blue herons and great egrets. So they're beginning their migration thoughts, and they sometimes will gather in big numbers. In fact, if you went down to Cootes Paradise tonight, you might encounter some great blue herons. And on Hickory Island the other night, we counted 18 of them, 18 great egrets. But we've seen over 40 in one night. They go there to roost. What time of year do pelicans show up? Usually in the spring. So they follow the coastline up, and then they just kick right across some of them, and they'll see coots, and they'll just fly down and land for a couple of days. So sometimes we'll get 1 or 2. Sometimes we'll get 9. Sometimes they stay around for a day or 2. Sometimes just a couple hours. Sometimes a week. So you never know. I've only got about 8 minutes left here, so I'm just trying to scooch through some of these. Both of these birds are bald eagles. I saw 2 adults today. I was driving over the high-level bridge, and 2 adult bald eagles flew right over me. White head and white tail, big dark body. But if you see one with this mottled look to it, there's a good chance you're looking at an immature bald eagle. And yes, we get them They breed on Cootes Paradise. They had 2 eaglets this year, and there's 3 young that have been hanging out the last couple of years. So the other day we counted 7 bald eagles on a birding walk I was on at RBG. And then osprey. Tom was mentioning an osprey nest at the corner of Plains Road and kind of Highway 6 area, and they predominantly eat fish, which is pretty cool, and they do not stick around in the wintertime. This is the nest on Cootes that we built to attract them way back in the late 2008, 2009. And osprey nests love these big platforms, so you'll often see that. Raptor migration is big right now, so we've got red-tailed hawks, red-shouldered hawks, merlin. We've got Cooper's hawk. We've got sharp-shin hawk. The fastest animal on the planet is a peregrine falcon that has been clocked at reaching speeds of over 350 kilometers per hour. We get snowy owls, great horned owls, northern saw-whet owls that are only about this big, and vultures flying around in big kettles. You'll see these spring, summer, and fall, and not so much in the wintertime, only eating dead animals. A very cool raptor. Not a raptor, but we get northern shrike around here that impale their prey on thorns, which is a very crazy thing to do. So sometimes known as the butcher birds. We get lots of birds that specialize in grasslands like bobolink and grasshopper sparrows, and eastern meadowlarks. We're at kind of the tail end of warbler migration. So we get yellow-rumped warbler, yellow warbler, pine warbler, black-throated green. Blue-gray gnatcatchers occur around here, tufted titmice, gray catbird, northern mockingbirds, red-winged blackbirds, ruby-throated hummingbirds, Baltimore orioles, rose-breasted grosbeak. Like, look at the biodiversity that occurs in the Hamilton and Burlington area in the eco park system. It's incredible. These birds look like tropical birds to me. When I first learned that we've got scarlet tanagers and indigo buntings breeding in the area, I was blown away. These look like they live in the Amazon rainforest, but they're found around here. Aerial insectivores and tree swallows, barn swallows, northern rough-winged swallows, or chimney swifts occur here. And we've got wrens living around us, Carolina house, winter, and marsh wren. And rounding back into the city, you know we've got crows, American crows, rock doves, and ring-billed gulls, herring gulls. There's actually in the birding world, there's no actual one bird known as a seagull. These are all the different types of gulls that occur in North America. So we never refer to them as seagulls. In fact, we don't really have an ocean around here. If you're going to call them something, call them a bay gull. But these are all the different kind of gulls that can occur around here. So this is just kind of a running joke in the birding community. So this is over just 60 species of birds. And in 1 year, we get over 300 species, millions upon millions of birds passing through the Hamilton area every migration. So millions and millions of birds. But there's a reason why people are so keen on birds around here, and there's levels, there's tiers to your birding should you choose to enter into this world, because it's great and incredible to go for a walk and to observe birds around you. It's cool to feed them if you're doing it properly. It's great to join clubs and to attend talks, to join walks, to buy binoculars, to be observing these birds. You can just be working on that if you choose to. And then the more you start to learn about it, the more involved or the less involved you can get. It's totally up to you. But as professionals are watching birds and as we're studying the data, there is concerning trends in certain species. And again, this can be things that you can look up on your own time, but we're looking at the decline of millions of birds over the last 30 years. And every year, certain populations trend downwards, especially some of those aerial insectivores, and which can be perhaps attributed to the higher use of pesticides around North America in certain locations that are lessening the insect population, which in turn lessens the bird population, because we know they're all part of the food chain. Birds are incredible at controlling certain populations of other life occurring around here. We know that life thrives in a web. We know where there's biodiversity. We've got a lot of great life occurring, but when we start seeing species disappearing, we start getting into more monocultures or very, species dominant areas. And we don't want that. We want to have a lot of diversity around here. So you could carry your birding forward and contribute as a citizen scientist and submit your to an app called eBird, which is observed by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology through down in the United States or even Birds Canada. And they analyze the data of everyday birders like you and I just by what you submit into eBird. Now, again, that's a few levels up. So again, don't get too concerned about it. You can keep track simply in your own notebook. I for the longest time was just keeping my bird sightings in this book here, and I'd write down what I'd see and maybe some dates. And then when I got into eBird, it keeps track of your lists for you, which is pretty cool. But just know that anyone can be a birder. You don't need to be a pro. You don't need to know all these species. You just step outside. You just observe, slow down, and just hang out. Stop in a spot, sit, quiet your body, quiet your mind, take your headphones out, and just observe what's going on around you. Because that's where that greater appreciation for nature is going to occur, is when you stop and look at it. A lot of people, when they hike, they're just moving. They want to get out and move their bodies. Great, no problem. They want to walk with a friend, catch up. Great, no problem. But you might notice that there's you're around a corner and there's 5 people standing there completely silent. And they're observing and they're listening to the birds that are around them. And then that might force you to slow down a little bit as well. And then when you're slow, when you stop, is maybe when you'll start to hear some pips and some cheeps and some things happening around you. And that then connects you closer to that creature and closer to this planet, because we are living in a really weird time right now. And we hear the word crisis a lot. We hear the term biodiversity crisis, which is why so many people are doing what they're doing, because trying to observe it so then we can talk about it. And talking about it with you, and then you talk about it with your family, and it's just this grassroots movement. So all of these organizations are accepting of anybody from anywhere at any skill level. We want you to be a part of this world, and we welcome you to it.